All right, so today we had a few different stories coming out of the Supreme Court. We're going to touch on them and look at some subtleties, a little bit of nuance in what's happening here. So the first, the one that's making the most news, is that the Supreme Court came out and decided to protect LGBTQ rights. So this was kind of up in the air. People didn't know how this was going to go because if you look back at the civil rights legislation that they were looking at, there's a number of protected classes, right? And the closest that would have anything to do with LGBTQ rights would be discriminating on the basis of sex, okay? And so there's been some arguments back and forth about exactly how this is going to turn out, and the Supreme Court decided to protect LGBTQ rights, which was kind of a surprise, especially considering that Neil Gorsuch came out on the side of protecting LGBTQ rights, which is interesting because that's not what he was put in there for, right? That in fact is the opposite of why the conservatives put him in place. So let's take just a little bit of a back step here. So remember, under the Obama presidency, Obama was supposed to get to nominate a Supreme Court pick. McConnell said, nope, not going to happen. And they basically just reserved that pick for almost 1/4 of Obama's second term so that they could hand it to Trump. Okay. So then Trump, basically just took who his donors to tell him to pick, and he picked Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, right? So Kavanaugh's the one that shouldn't even really be on the Supreme Court. Trump should have only got to pick one. He ended up getting to pick two, but they put him there with the expressed. It was totally understood he's supposed to side with conservatives, right? Because that's what we've become now is the Supreme Court. People are falling down on the side of the people who put them in place. That's the whole point of the court packing that McConnell is doing. Well, in this case, it was a surprise to many people that Neil Gorsuch came out and actually protected humans based on the law. So it was in question for a while how they were going to justify this, since in the law it says sex. But some good points were brought up. So we have to remember, right? We tend to have feelings about how the Supreme Court decides on stuff. But remember, the Supreme Court is not there to pick right and wrong. In fact, Neil Gorsuch is even on tape saying, look, you don't want the justice deciding what is good and what is bad. They're supposed to be there to interpret the law. And this is one time where I agree with Neil Gorsuch. The whole way the Constitution is written, the Supreme Court is there to interpret the law. They're there to interpret the law and decide what is lawful, what is not lawful. And love it or hate it, we kind of have to stick with that because that's the way our country is formed. So the question was, how would they come up with this? And the conservatives are saying, well, it doesn't say transgender or gay in the law, so therefore you can't interpret it as protecting those people. Well, Neil Gorsuch wrote the opinion that all the justices who voted with him signed on to. And basically it came out to this. If you try to discriminate against someone on the basis of grounds that are LGBTQ related, if you try to make that argument, try to make it without sex being part of the argument, right? Because let's say it's a homosexual individual who's working for you and you decide to fire that person for being homosexual. Well, you're firing that person because of a man loving a man, right? So there it is right there. There's sex involved. You don't like the fact that two people of the same sex have decided that they love each other and want to have a life together. That's sex right there. You're bringing up exactly the wording that's used in the law that was to be protected. So in this case, I would say Neil Gorsuch got it right. Right? Any LGBTQ issues are in essence sex-related issues, and I don't mean the act of sex. We're talking about in broad terms here, gender and sex and those kinds of things. It's pretty hard to argue any of these issues without those terms coming up. So I think in this case they got it right. I think it's sound. Of course, the conservatives are coming out of the woodwork and say that this was actually Neil Gorsuch legislating, right? That's the accusation that they like to throw around, is that these judges are actually legislating. But in this case, if you actually dig into it, I think there's a pretty good case that they interpreted the law, and I think it's a reasonable way in which they interpreted the law. So good job. This decision came down 6-3, so it wasn't even a 5-4 decision. It was a 6-3 decision. So even if Gorsuch had gone the other way, still would have been 5-4. So good. It's a big win for the LGBTQ community. And there's a lot of states where there wasn't any kind of laws in place protecting people. Now there's federal law that says you can't discriminate against people on these grounds. So it will be great when we get to a point in society where we stop finding people to marginalize. We stop finding people who the details of their lives we don't like, and we're going to tell them, hey, you don't get to work here. You don't get to do what everyone else gets to do. Why don't we just start treating people like people, maybe, and stop worrying about what they do in their private lives, right? If a person wants to have a job and they do a good job at their job, then let them have a job. Don't worry about who they love. Don't worry about who they want to be with. It's not really any of your business. So I don't know why we're still finding groups of people that we can justify it's okay to marginalize and to hold back, right? It's totally ridiculous. So in other Supreme Court news, what we want to remember is that it takes 4 justices to vote to pick up a case. In other words, there's lots of cases that go to the Supreme Court that the Supreme Court says, yeah, we're not dealing with this. We're not gonna hear this right now. It takes 4 justices to step up and say, yep, this should be a part of what we're gonna hear. In a decision that seems a little untimely, the Supreme Court refuses to hear cases on qualified immunity for police. This would go a long way. So remember, qualified immunity is a law that's been around for numerous decades. It was put in place to protect the police officers from frivolous lawsuits. That is, something unimportant goes wrong, some weird thing happens, and then all of a sudden you sue the police officer for it. There needed to be some kind of protection in place to make sure that kind of thing didn't happen. So what happened is they came up with this qualified immunity that basically said, unless there is precedent that it's okay to sue a cop for this, then they get to walk, right? And it turns out, as we can see, that was too much protection. Okay, that went way overboard to the point where now there is so much protection that even when we see videos of these cops doing terrible things, it's oftentimes hard to fire them, largely because of qualified immunity. So while people are literally in the streets over issues like qualified immunity, the Supreme Court decided they weren't going to hear it. I don't know. And there's people on both sides that want this, right? Conservative and liberal justices want this. Sotomayor and Clarence Thomas both wanted to take this up, but they couldn't get enough other judges to go along with it. So the Supreme Court will not presently be hearing cases on qualified immunity by police, which could go a long ways towards making a difference in policing, right? So maybe they're leaving it up to the legislature. Maybe they're saying, this could be a good example of them saying, you know what? We're the justices. We're not legislators. Why don't we let the legislature come up with a law, like write a law, and then we'll see how it moves through the courts, right? That could be part of the thinking here. So if the current protests continue to go on the way that they have, we cannot just ignore qualified immunity. We're going to have to take a look at it, whether that's Congress taking a look at it, ultimately being vetoed by the president, or whether that's the Supreme Court picking it up and doing something about it. But we can't just leave it like it is and just continue to ignore this issue. Qualified immunity is giving way too much protection to the police, right? Needs to be looked at. And in another case, the Supreme Court will not be hearing. The Supreme Court won't hear challenge to California sanctuary laws. So basically right now in California, what they're basically doing is saying there's a limit to how much state authorities will cooperate with federal authorities in regards to deporting people. Trump administration doesn't like that and is basically trying to have a fit about it. And the Supreme Court's saying, no, this is one of the things we're not going to hear about. So kind of, again, depends on how you feel about this particular subject, but it will not be going before the Supreme Court, and the Trump administration is not happy about it. So that was the news coming out of the Supreme Court today. We'll see where things go in the future. We'll see what's going to happen with these stories, but a big day for the LGBTQ community. That's great. It's always good when, human beings get to get treated like human beings. That's always a win. So we'll keep an eye on the Supreme Court. We'll see where things go from here. It's kind of a dust up. This kind of getting the conservatives a little bit riled up. We'll see if this energizes their base or what's going to come from this. We'll see. But so far, overall, largely a good day coming out of the Supreme Court. So thanks for checking out the video. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you can check out all the new videos as they become available. And we will see you in the future.